welcome everybody. It is almost Valentine's Day. So hopefully as you see, there's no flowers here on the desk, but hopefully you've had a lovely Valentine's Day just passed. It's an early office hours for me. We do it every third Thursday for me on the month. So it just so happens it's an early Thursday. Obviously, before I start, sing out if you can't see me in the chat line. Sing out if you can't hear me. I'll wait. Pause. Nope. Hopefully all the bits and pieces are working correctly. Have to admit, spent the last couple of hours watching the Olympics, waiting for office hours. It's winding up. I do like the Winter Olympics simply because we don't really have much of the concept of snow here in Australia, or certainly on my side of the nation. Over East, they get some snow. And in fact, as I warned anyone last month, if throughout the next hour you start to see me basically melt like the Wicked Witch of the East or West from the Wizard of Oz, that's because it was another 40-degree day here in Perth. That's 110-ish or so in Fahrenheit if you use that scale. And because I don't like the audio being interrupted, the air conditioner is turned off. So to keep you nice, crisp and clear audio, I'll get hotter and sweatier and generally more disgusting as the hour goes on, but hopefully that won't detract too much from the technical content. One little word of warning, I took my dog to the vet today. He needed to get some work done on his teeth, so he's been under anesthetic most of the day. He's home now. He's looking in a very weird position just at my left there. He's sort of half asleep, half unconscious, half all over the shop. So at some stage, I think when the anesthetic wears off fully, he might suddenly be a normal dog again and maybe jump in and join us or be desperately need to get out. So a word of warning, there may be a crazed animal entering the chat at some stage, but hopefully it won't create too much distraction. Okay, let me bring up the chat line so I can see. Oh, someone likes the Pac-Man t-shirt. Oh, yep, I'm very retro. A little bit of retro music as well, hopefully, if you joined a bit early. Let me share my screen and we'll jump into this month's office hours. So once again, hopefully you can now see me, hear me, and see my slides as well. For regulars on office hours, apologies for the first few slides. It's just in case there are new people. To get in touch with me, I love talking technology. That's one of the reasons we run office hours sessions. Rather than slam you with a million links, just head over to linktree/Connor and you'll get all my Instagram, podcast, blog, etc., 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 etc. Feel free to reach out to me on any of those channels. Probably the easiest way is on Twitter. That's at Connor McDonald. My direct messages are always open, so always feel you can reach out and get in touch with me that way if you have queries or ponderances. Sometimes I'll redirect you to Ask Tom to answer a question there such that the entire community benefits from any answers we may give. But yeah, I love talking technology, so feel free to reach out to me on Ask Tom. The slide content will look weird if you're a first timer to my office hours. Often it'll be tucked away at the left like that, or it'll be at the bottom of the screen or moved around a bit. That's because we record all these sessions, as you're aware, I'm sure, and they all go onto YouTube and we plonk the webcam somewhere on the screen, hopefully to not interrupt the content. I'm sure you've been on one of those webinars where you're sitting there and that precious nugget of information that you are after is blocked by the speaker's webcam. So we do our best to avoid that by shifting the content around a bit, so don't be alarmed. I always start with some bits and pieces. It's a little bit of call it a New Year's resolution, mainly in terms of trying to get a bit more PR, publicity, marketing, what would you like to call it, out to the various events that are coming. User groups, as I said last month, have been doing it incredibly hard the last couple of years. We're almost sort of on the way out of the nightmare, the hardship. And so some of the user groups are starting to have in-person events. Some of them are still having virtual events. But I like to be giving a little push here because it's so important that we actually support those user groups. They are the lifeblood of our Oracle community. So a couple of call for papers. Apex World in the Netherlands. I've attended this a few times in the past. It's an in-person event, so I will not be attending this year. At the moment, you cannot travel out of Western Australia, even to other parts of the country. And hopefully that will be lifted soon once we get through our Omicron. But yeah, so if you're in Europe, the call for papers for Apex World, if you're in any way involved in Apex or database-centric applications, please throw in a submission there and make that event a success. Another one more on this side of the woods. This one will be a virtual one. So if you are in my time zone, or if you're in a time zone that would suit giving a a presentation in this time zone. Like, for example, it might be your lunchtime in Europe. This is the APEC set of APEC days that'll run throughout the first half of the year, presented by good friend Francisco. And effectively, this will be done virtually through the Komu or My Komu platform. It's a nice, simple platform you can similar to Zoom. Polish Oracle User Group was virtual last year. I think hybrid, slightly in person and slightly virtual. I did the virtual part. That'll be coming up later this year. The call for papers is out now. Fantastic event. Certainly a really strong, small but strong user group. Lots of good, strong community feels there. You'll always feel welcome as an attendee or a speaker at these events. This is what I'm doing next week. If you're somewhere involved in the rest of the world somewhere, I'm talking at the East Coast Oracle User Group event. So that's pretty much the opposite side of the world. So I think it's an in-person event, but they're doing a few virtual sessions as well. And I've been invited to do the keynote. Very appreciative of that. I'll be talking about where on earth should you be storing your data? Because let's face it, the good old days of just a single database have come and gone. Now there are so many vendors, so many options, so many platforms, so many architectures for you to choose from. What are the cons and pros and cons, the pitfalls, the advantages of using them? How many databases should you have, etc. So I'll be doing that talk next week. And I think the day after, I'll be doing a talk on 21C new features for the Italian Oracle User Group. Once again, this one's always tinged with a bit of sadness because this is an event I'd actually attended until COVID came along. My mother is Italian, and so it was always good to get back to Italy, go to both Rome and Milan and meet the Oracle people there, as well as the Oracle User Group, Italian Oracle User Group. Lovely bunch of folks, but hopefully you can support them as well. And I got you, if you've submitted for Kscope, you would have got your acceptances and your rejections. I got a couple of each for Kscope coming up. This will be in Texas. That's, I think, in June. I'm hoping that I can travel before then because this is an in-person event. I'm hoping to do my first travel in this part of 3 years because this is a huge event, and I'm hoping to do a couple of talks there, topics to be announced later. But yeah, if you're involved in any way, shape or form in the developer community, Kscope is probably one of the headline events you want to be either attending or hopefully if you're a speaker there, catch up with me and we'll meet somewhere at a bar or a restaurant and we'll talk Oracle tech. Final bit of marketing before we jump into the content. The podcast continues to roll along and I've been talking with Nigel Bayless. Nigel's a good friend. I've known Nigel for a long time and he's the Optimizer product manager. And because we're talking Optimizer, there's obviously a lot to talk about. A lot of people have a love-hate relationship with the Oracle Optimizer. So in that sense, I did probably an hour and a half talk with him. So I've broken up into 4 episodes. I think probably tomorrow I'll have finished editing the last episode. So part 4 will go out, I think tomorrow or over the weekend. So yeah, that's a nice 4-part series talking about probably the smartest optimizer guy in the business. So if you have any theories and concerns about the optimizer, I'll hopefully get a lot of value out of those podcast episodes. And finally, me doing my standard, jumping up on the soapbox before I start the content. The way we get out of this, the way we can get back to, I'd be selfish here, the way we can get back to traveling and going to events and being face-to-face and sitting down with a beer and having a good old chat is to get out of this pandemic, get ourselves vaccinated. Let's get our communities back super strong, back to where they were back in 2018 and put all this, finally kick COVID off the bottom of our shoe, at least to the best of our abilities. As I used to say, let's not be this guy. If you're a Novak fan, my apologies. But yeah, let's be people who actually get ourselves healthy and get ourselves back in the Oracle community. What are we going to talk about tonight? So I've got 5 topics. I've given up on putting 6 or 7 in there because we never get to them. Hopefully we'll get through the 5. Recovery with just the data files. How to explain sudden SQL performance drops when literally nothing else has changed. A best practice for SQL tuning. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but effectively someone said, look, I'm sick and tired of all the books and all the blogs and all the 37-step processes. Give me something simple, a simple methodology for tuning SQL. So I've tried to come up with a very short, simple, succinct technique that always generally works for me. Issues with DBMS metadata. Most people know that we use that to get our DDL. What happens when you start using it in PL SQL routines? There's a few gotchas in there. And finally, we'll talk about Aura 257. Now, before we jump in, I left it deliberately nice and obtuse. Who wants to sing out on the chat line? See, what's Aura 257? If you've never seen it, that's a good thing. If you have, you'll probably know the error code pretty well. Anyone want to have a guess? It's a tough one. It's not like, Aura sort of, what's it, 942, table does not exist. 257, you can have a guess. Otherwise, we're going to jump straight into it. Someone's got it. The archiver error. That's right. Aura 257 is when you run out of space and you can no longer archive your reader logs. What do we do? So a question came in on a particular topic related to that, and we'll cover that if time admits. So let's just jump into it and we'll see how we go. As always, if you have any questions or comments, throw them in the chat or the Q&A. From time to time, you'll see my head just swivel back this way, and hopefully we'll cover them all off. Interactive is good. I like talking tech. Database recovery. And in this a particularly sort of awkward form of database recovery. Here's the question that came in. Is it possible to restore an Oracle database from just the DBF files recovered from a failed Linux machine? Now, it's a fairly vague sort of question, but it's one of those things where you may have stumbled across a machine. It obviously had an Oracle database running at some way, shape, or form, but you might not know anything about it. Typically from the file structure, you might know what the name of the database is, but generally you might just have the data files, or it might have the data files and the control files, etc. And so my response to this question when it came in was, well, maybe. You might be able to get it back and you might not. As I said, it's a bit of a vague question. There's a lot of possible scenarios. What if the database was actually shut down before this machine was just ripped off the shelf and thrown on the scrap heap? Well, you might have a bit of luck in that sense. What if the database was simply switched off? Or sorry, the machine was simply switched off. Or at some point, no one even knew there was an Oracle database running on it. I've worked in IT departments in the past where it's amazing how server kitchens just to float around, sits in the back of the computer room somewhere, and eventually someone goes, what's that for? It's often the case also that the machines that you don't know what they're doing are the ones that when you switch off, everything goes to hell in your data center. But yeah, these things do happen. And there are other scenarios. Do I have just the database files? Do I have the control files? Do I have the redo logs? Do I have the init.oras, etc.? There's a various permutations here that we need to consider. So that's why I said maybe, but I thought I'd cover a couple of possible scenarios on that premise of you've simply discovered a server lying on the floor in the data center somewhere, and you've switched it on and you see that there are actually some Oracle sort of data files floating around. How do you actually see what's in them? How do you get that database back up and running? So I'm going to start with a database called Dunk, and there's no particular name special for the name Dunk. It's more the fact that it's a database of junk, because what we're going to do is we're going to look at if we have a cold copy of the data files, can we restore it? Or if we have a hot copy of the data files, i.e. the database was not cleanly shut down, at which point this machine was simply maybe powered off. And we're going to try restore it into a database called junk. And that's why I came up with the name Dunk. Simply, it's a simple translation to a junk database. And I'm calling it junk not just for comic effect. I'm calling it junk because whenever you have to restore a database that you don't really know what the contents are, you don't know what state it was in, it's important not to restore it, get it open, and then just go, oh, great, now we can start using it. Generally, when you don't know the background of a database, I would look at restoring it and then looking at doing things like, for example, using data pump to unload all the data, etc. Trying to get it to a new database where you have greater levels of control. In that way, you're not going to have potential sort of a noose around your neck, drifting off into the future. You might have this database up and running for several months, and all of a sudden it crashes with an Aura 600 because you didn't restore one of the files that's now needed, etc. So it's always good if you have some sort of unsurety about the source of a database file and its quality. Unload it with data pump when you're done, just to make sure you've now got a clean baseline and you're ready to go. So let's do a demo. I need to do a new share. So this is just VirtualBox running, I think, of Oracle 19. I might be, what have I got? 1912. I'm just looking at the title of the Windows. So it's probably running about 1912 or something later. I'm in a directory called cold here. And let me just, what I did was I took a cold backup of this database called Dunk, and I took a cold backup of just the data files. The reader logs are there, control files are there, but they are simply, you'll see shortly, effectively not going to be needed to be used. So I'm going to run restore, and it's going to do the entire demo for us. So the first thing I'm going to do is, just in case this instance called junk was running, I kill it off. So it's just not there. Then I'm going to remove all the files. So all the files that were in U01 app Oracle Oradata junk, I've simply removed them. And now I'm going back into my cold directory and restoring just the data files. So you can see here, now that I think I'm pausing here, the only files I've restored, simply copied back into place where the database should be, are these ones: sysorg, system, undo, and users. To keep this running relatively quickly, I made a very small database. It's not a container database because this way the number of files and their sizes is very, very small. Makes the demo nice and quick for you. So this was done from a cold backup. I simply shut the database down and I copied the data files somewhere. If you find a machine like this, it's trivial to get this database back up, even if you have no control files, because all the control file really does is nominate where to find the rest of the files in your database. Over time, the control file can contain other information. It contains things like your RMAN catalog. If you're not using it, that stuff will disappear if you're just creating a control file from scratch. But if you've just got the data files, the basic control file structure is simply to nominate, to tell the database where to find the rest of the database. So let's do that. So I've got the standard stuff already preceded there. So I've already got the init junk.ora and I've got a password file. These can be created just with ora password command, and obviously you can just use your favorite text editor to create yourself a basic init.ora. So they're already there. Let's see how we go. So all I have to do is, the first thing I do is start up no mount. That's the only option you have if you don't have a control file. Because normally when you start the database up, it tries to go into what we call a mount state, which is use the control file to go find the data files. If you haven't got a control file, you can't mount the database. So the only thing you can do is do a startup no mount. For those that are unfamiliar with this evolution of startup, no mount simply says create all the memory structures and processes used to run a database, but that's all. It doesn't actually reach out to the database files themselves. It has no knowledge besides the init.ora file and perhaps the password file to connect. So I've started up this database in no mount form. In fact, you can see I've set the RAM very, very low because it's a small VM. And this is all we have to do. We have to simply manually create one of these create control file commands. I cheated. Before I shut my database down, I backed up the control file to trace, so I had the nice text version, but you could literally use VI or any Vim, etc. to simply create this. I'm simply setting my database to a name named junk, even though I backed it up a database called dunk. By using the set database command, I'm effectively assigning a new name to it. I'm choosing reset logs because I don't have any redo logs. I did a cold backup. The reader logs might be there, but they're gone, we're assuming in this instance. All I had was the data files. So reset logs will actually create me some new reader logs. I nominate where I want my reader logs to be, and then I simply list the 4 data files that I've restored from tape, from wherever, or simply put back into the right location. If I found those files already in the right location, I don't even have to restore them like I did in this script here. I simply have to nominate a control file as to where they are. I run that. And what that does is the database has now gone from a no mount state, which is just the memory and the processes, to what we call a mounted state, because I've told the database where the data files will be. And in fact, do I print it out? Yeah. If I do select open mode from VDOL the database, we've transitioned now from no mount to mount state. And then it's just alter database open reset logs. What reset logs does is effectively look at these control files. Can I scroll back? Yeah. And says, these are the 3 new reader logs I'm going to create. Now, what's missing from a control file? We have the reader logs, we have the data files. If you need to sort, obviously we need a temporary table space. And so all I need to do now is alter table space, add a temp file. Now I can do some sorting. If I didn't know what the name of the table space was, I could simply do a select star from VDOL table space or DBA table spaces, because my database is now open in the normal way, and then add myself a temp file, and we're done. So the easiest way when you have a database which was cold backed up and you only have the data files, it's trivial. Manually create a control file with some text editor and you're away and running. Your database is up. There was no database recovery required because the database was shut down in a nice clean fashion and you are off and running. That database is fine. So that's the easy way. Let's now go to for hot. So this is the exact same example, except this time when I copied my database files, I didn't shut the database down. So they're basically not good, clean copies of the files. Let's see what happens. So exact as before, the demo, I'm killing the existing instance, so it's gone. I'm going to remove all the data files, so they're all gone, and I'm restoring these 4 files. So it looks exactly like the cold demo, except these 4 files were simply copied out of the database without the database being shut down. So they're not good, clean backups. But there's my 4 files restored. Let's go through the same process. I've got my standard prereqs as before. I've got my init.junk.or, my password file, they're unchanged. Let's first of all start the database in no mount again because there is no control file. My job is to create that. So here we go, startup force no mount. You can talk idly amongst yourselves while my poor VM struggles here, along with Zoom and recording the Zoom and capturing the video to try startup. And I'll also check the Q&A line while that's happening. Okay, what if we choose the wrong character set? That's a valid point. If you get the wrong character set, you'll generally have problems opening your database. But one would imagine, and please sing out if I'm being biased here because I come from a monolingual country. In my time, the vast majority of data sets nowadays, character sets, are UTF-8 or the single byte character sets that come by default with the region you install it in. So typically, for example, if you're running a Windows database anywhere on the West Coast or in Australia, you're going to get the MS Win 1252 character set. So I would imagine you could quite easily go through a number of examples and see what you could and get it open. So I've got this one started in no mount state. Oops, let's go back to here. I create my control file. It looks exactly the same as before. I'm doing reset logs as well. And the control file gets created fine. See, at this point, the database hasn't gone and looked at those data files. It simply said, you're telling me where they are. It doesn't know that they're not great quality. They weren't nice and cleanly backed up. So it's going to let you happily create the control file. Let's now try alter database open. Oh, sorry, the database is mounted as before. Let's try open reset logs. And the database says, this is the first time I've gone and looked at the headers of those data files, and they're all over the shop. They're not all in sync. Each one has perhaps a different SCN, and therefore the databases need to be recovered to bring them into alignment. At this point, I'm in a bit of trouble because I only have the data files. If I can find the archive logs, great. I could then roll them forward in a normal way, but there's no archive logs here. I've got nothing. And this is where you have some dramas. If someone's just switched the machine off, there's a good chance you're not going to find all the information you need. What do? Well, I'll just try to recover. So recover database using backup control file. Because this is it's being run as a script, not interactive, it automatically tried to find the next archive file. If it was there, great, I would have been fine. I could have rolled forward and hopefully recovered, but it's not. I've lost the archives. There are no archives. And so I was like, can't archive, and it simply canceled my recovery. And you can see I'm still stuck. I can't open my database because the databases are no longer in sync. What do? Before you do this, and I'll come back to this in the slides as well, you pause, you shut everything down, and you perhaps take a copy of all your data files such that you know where you're at. You have a baseline, but then you can start looking, as I put here, only under the advice of Oracle support. We allow some certain parameters that will let you get a database open bypassing the normal checks. This is simply one of such parameters. You can have various scenarios in which you need to set other parameters depending on things like the quality of your system table space or your undo table space, etc., whether there are some corrupted rollback segments, etc. There are various hidden parameters that we allow under the guidance of Oracle support to get your database open to at least get you something. So here's an alternate init.org parameter called init corrupt instead of init junk, and I've added this hidden parameter to let my database open even though it's no longer logically consistent. So I'll start up force no mount, this time with this new init.org parameter, which is going to let me effectively open my database in a broken state. Once again, you can talk amongst yourselves while my poor little VM does its best. Frank said, does your create control file command mount the DB? Yes, it does. So running a running a create control file command will transition your database from unmounted or no mounted to mount state. Okay, so my system has come up in no mount state. I do alter database mount. I was simply being lazy here because I'd already had the control file put in place. I ran the create control. God, I'm going to struggle with that, aren't I? I ran the create control file command in the previous time. That control file is still sitting there. So I can just do alter database mount. And I can do alter database reset logs because I am allowing reset corruption to be true. But as I prompted here, I cannot stress enough, there is a difference between a database being open and a database being open and in a giant mess. You've literally taken a database here. I think that's the end of the script. Yeah. I've taken the database here and said the various files are no longer consistent with each other. So even, for example, within a single table space, it might well be the case that one table, which spans multiple data files, because extents might span data files, might be able to read half the table, the other half might be totally hogwash. Or even worse, you might be able to read the table cleanly, but it actually represents different points in time. So I cannot stress enough, the two things that are important at this exercise is not just, oh, look, Connor showed me a hidden parameter. Let's just throw that in our system when we have trouble getting our database open. The first thing is you never do any of these kind of things without talking to support first. I should have switched this text around. So you always talk to support first, get their guidance. And what I meant there by do not go backwards is it's amazing how many people will have a problem, whether they just found a server in the data center or they've got a problem getting their database open, and they'll try 5 or 6 things first. And then when they failed, they'll phone support. But sometimes those 5 or 6 things are the actions that have actually made your database unrecoverable by anyone. Whenever you get this point where your database can't be opened, generally what I do is I shut the database down, shut down abort, such that I'm not touching any data files, and I'll copy what I've got there somewhere else if possible. Now, if it's a 20 terabyte database, that might not be feasible. But I'm trying to get a point where I've got a baseline where if I can always come back to here, I can come back to the point at which I started tackling my problem. Because if you don't do that and you go ahead and do 5 or 6 things, it might well be the case that you'll finally get to support with a Sev 1 and they'll go, that thing you did in step 3, yeah, that's totally screwed us. We can't do anything now. So be aware of that. Always get to that point where you don't make the problem worse. In fact, I think there's a NASA quote. I was watching an interview with an astronaut and he was saying, whenever we have a problem on the space shuttle or the space station, they said, we always pause because there is no single problem that cannot be made worse. And that's true. So don't go backwards and always talk to support first. If you do have a database which even with these hidden parameters you cannot get open, Oracle Support actually does have even more low-level emergency facilities. What they will do is they can actually we have some programs that will actually read your blocks, block by block, and extract the data out. At which point then you'd be up into a full reload through your database, probably with things like SQL Loader, because it's just going to come out as flat data. But be aware, we do have some very low-level facilities in those absolute dire emergency situations. I think you might be charged a fee to engage services to do that, but in the worst case scenario, it is possibly to get that data back. So hopefully that all makes sense. Have I missed a slide? I was going to say. Oh, maybe I didn't. Maybe. I thought I had a slide in there. I reckon it's going to appear later on somewhere in this deck. I had a slide in there saying, whilst I appreciate any database questions, be aware that we also have a dedicated database backup and recovery office hours held by the database backup and recovery PMs. And if you ever have a problem with recovery or backup, please jump into their office hours because these are the experts. They'll be able to go through your RMAN scripts, give you advice as to where they're failing, etc. So we got some dedicated specialists on backup and recovery with their own office hours run every month. So I'll happily tackle any question you throw at me, but be aware that we have extra specialists floating around on particular topic areas. Okay, a couple of Q&As. Will a setting of allow reset logs corruption equals true help when there are uncommitted transactions inside the undo table space? You'll generally be able to get your database open but you may have all sorts of dramas. And there are other, as I mentioned, there are other hidden parameters as well, which do allow things along the lines of simply offlining certain rollback segments or undo segments if they're causing you problems. So a particular undo segment can't be bought online. There are special parameters that will let you simply say, ignore them and bring the database online anyway. All these things effectively heading you further and further down the path of more and more corruptions at the compromise of just being able to get being able to salvage what you can out of the database. Your hidden parameter allows reset logs corruption. How come you are able to open the data? Let me read that slowly because I'm reading it to myself. Frank asks, your hidden parameter allows reset logs corruption. How come you are able to open a DB with unsynchronized data files? Reset logs corruption is really saying, I want to be able to get my database with a fresh set of reader logs, even though normally you would not be allowed to do that with a corrupted set of data files. And that's why it's perhaps just semantics there. We're not really saying that our reader logs are corrupted. What we're saying is, I want to allow the command alter database open reset logs, even though when I check the data files, I would not normally permit it. So it was really just a concept of semantics. Reset logs corruption is really saying I'm allowing the database to be corrupt, not my redo logs to be corrupt. Because when you do reset logs, we get you fresh redo logs anyway. They will be clean, but they just will no longer reflect the mess you've left in your data files. Okay. It's funny how we never get questions, my SQL performance has gone suddenly fast. It's never a question that comes in. It's always these ones. My SQL performance has suddenly dropped. Here's the question that came in. We've come across this issue of sudden SQL performance degradation due to a change in a plan, but there are no changes to the code or to the stats. How is this possible? And I'll do a demo which hopefully demonstrates this. But here's probably the most common thing that people sometimes struggle with. If you change nothing, the plans can still change. And this is most of the time a good thing. And we'll explain with a demo. But it's one of those things where I've encountered DBAs in the past, and I've been guilty of this myself in the past, where I thought, I've got a system which is running nicely, I'll lock the stats. Or I know the system is relatively static anyway, the amount of changes going on is never going to get me over the threshold where stats will be regathered. Therefore, I'm happy with the way the system is running, the stats aren't changing, and yet somehow the plans all of a sudden change. It's like Oracle is out to get me, or the optimizer is out to get me. What's going on? So let's look at a demo now which talks about this. And the name of the script that I'm going to run probably gives you a clue as to what's going to go on here. I'm going to create a table here called orders. And the way I'm creating it here, I've got 100,000 rows scattered over 20 random days starting on the 29th of January, because this will bring us up to today. So if I run that, you'll see that what I've got is starting from 29th of January up until today, around about 5,000 orders per day. I'm a happily successful business and obviously very consistent. I get roughly 5,000 orders every day, every single day. We could assume this table goes back ad infinitum. I just didn't want to bore you with a 1 billion row population. But let's assume the table finishes today because today is the current day. We don't have orders in the future, but the data goes back as far as you'd like to go. Let's gather stats on that table. So there's not an issue here of missing stats. And let's do some queries. Now, the kind of queries that my application or ad hoc users are going to do is showing my recent orders. So it's going to be something like select star from orders where the date is greater than sysdate. Now, sysdate for me is it's almost 9 p.m. So the day is almost finished. So we haven't come up with exactly 5,000 rows. The database had shrunk it down a little bit less. That it's about 5,000 rows. And we can assume that every day, people are going to run these kinds of queries. Show me queries for the current day. So for the rest of this demo, I'm going to hard code dates, but I'm simulating that as days go on, I'm simply using sysdate. But obviously, I can't walk forward into the future. Otherwise, this alpha hours would run for several days. As Frank has said, create table also gathers stats automatically. Yeah, good point, Frank. Ever since Oracle 12.1, a create table as select, insert append into an empty table will automatically collect stats as you go. Don't have to do dbms gather stats afterwards. In 19C, on some versions, for example, autonomous, We got some very smart stats now where even if you have a table which has some stats and has some data, a direct load insert appending will actually update the stats as well. That's super cool. Blog post coming on that one. But I digress. So here's my queries now. It's the 17th of February, so I'm looking for all the rows past the 17th of February, and the database says, I reckon there'll be about 5,000. And as we saw from the real data, that's spot on. There's about 5,000 orders per day. We can assume that the optimizer will come up with a good plan when the estimate meets the reality. Now I've got this one. Tomorrow comes along, I need to insert another 5,000 rows. I'm going to get 5,000 rows tomorrow. So here's the 18th of Feb, plus around about, 4,964 rows. So tomorrow, people are going to run queries like this. For the 18th of February, show me the data. I inserted 4,900 rows, and the optimizer's doing a pretty good job still. It says I'm going to get about 4,700 rows. Order of magnitude, not much difference, about the same, so I'm expecting good plans again. Tomorrow comes along, so now it's tomorrow, that's the 19th of Feb, another 5,000 rows. Queries for the day after tomorrow, now it's dropped to about 4,400. It's still pretty close, 4 of 9,000, 4,900, 4,400. I'm probably going to be okay. Let's now do the 20th of February, another 5,000, and now it's 4,200. We can start to see a bit of a pattern here. We're starting to drift away from an accurate estimate. What happens after a week? So now I'm starting from the 21st of Feb, another 35,000 rows at 5,000 orders per day. So that's effectively a week's worth of data. So in a week's time, when I ask for the 28th of February, now I'm only half. So I'm only now half as good as an estimate. Now I'm starting to run perhaps into trouble, because when you start getting these, this is like twice as bad, or the estimate is twice as wrong, or half as wrong, depending on which way you want to view it, I'm more likely to get things like, instead of I wanted a hash join, I might get a nested loop, etc. And let's now continue on even further from 1st of March onward for another 100,000 rows. And now, once again, I'm looking for 20th of March. This will be 5,000 orders on this day, and the database thinks I'll get 1. So what's gone on here? The issue here is what we call boundary conditions. But this demonstrates the fact that all I've done is I've done no changes to the stats. Everything's the same. And yet all of a sudden, my plans are most likely to start going downhill, because we know there's 5,000 rows to be obtained here. The database thinks there'll only be 1. Pretty much that's a 5,000-fold order of magnitude problem, and therefore you're going to have all sorts of dramas there when it comes to coming up with execution plans. Here's where we are having dramas. If I go look at the stats, which I gathered at the start, we have these things called the low and high value, which are collected inside the database. The gathering stats collects this information, and you get this wonderfully cryptic information that comes out here. There's your low and high values. What does that mean to us? Not a great deal. However, in DBMS stats, we have conversion utilities to actually show us that data. So you can simply do convert raw value, and it shows you that the data is as we first gathered stats, 29th of January to the 17th of Feb. At which point you're probably going, well, hold on a second. If I've inserted all these extra thousands of rows over time, then I would regather stats. This is true in this trivial example. But as I said at the start, in a real example, your orders would go back maybe 5, 6, 10 years. Adding another week, even another month of data is not going to be a dramatic change to the stats in that table. In fact, the database is not going to regather stats until you change at least 10% of the data by default. So these are much more common occurrences because you're adding in 5,000 rows every single day, but you've got 10 million already. The volume of changes is tiny compared to the total volume of the table, so we're never going to change the stats. Therefore, these boundary conditions, when you start heading beyond the boundaries, we start getting these issues. Let's go back to the slides. So graphically, this is what the optimizer does. Because it stores the low and high bound for each column value that it's gathered stats on, it says by default that the distribution inside here is the same throughout. Histograms might change this, but by default, simply with low and high values, we have a common density between these two ranges. However, when you provide a predicate which is outside, either above the upper bound or below the lower bound, we use a scaling off algorithm to say it's unlikely based on my stats that there will be data out here. If I think the highest value is 17th of February, then querying for the 20th of February means I'm unlikely to find data, and so it scales that off. Back in the day, way back in Oracle 7, if you went above the boundary condition, we simply assumed 0. And that caused, no doubt, heaps of problems. But now we have this thing where we scale it off. You saw we went from 5,000 rows to 4,400 to 4,000, then to 2,000, and eventually all the way down to 1 as we went further and further away into the future from these high values that the optimizer knew about. So how do we solve this? One of the cool things, depending on what system you're running, if you're running, say, autonomous or an engineered system, we have a thing called real-time statistics in Oracle 19c. And what real-time stats does is, as you're doing DML, the database will actually track the DMLs you're running and from time to time decide, I can perhaps update the low and high values for various columns. It's not like a full gathering of stats. It's simply monitoring DML as we go. And what we call real-time stats is, as you do DML, as you keep inserting new rows all tagged with sysdate, it knows that I can push that high value further off into the future. Real-time stats is perhaps the thing that solves all these kind of queries where you're doing select for column greater than sysdate, where column greater than existing high value sequence number, etc. Real-time stats almost instantly solves this, but it's only available on certain systems. The other one is what we call the more frequent gathering of stats. Once again, on 19c, on certain systems, we look for stats that might be candidates every 15 minutes. Now, the stats still have to be stale. We have to cross that 10% boundary. But if we do, then we're much more likely to fix that problem quickly, as opposed to waiting for the next evening's statistics run. Some of the options you can do on your own systems is, if you know that you have systems that are sort of consistently moving forward with data, and you know that you've got issues with boundary conditions, you might, for example, change the percentage thresholds. By default, a table needs to change by 10% of activity before we regather stats. You could change that to, say, 5%, 1%, etc., using the set table preferences command. If you've listened to Nigel and Mai's podcast, he recommends always just making your modifications with preferences. Therefore, the standard nightly jobs will obey those preferences and pick up those table by table or schema by schema preferences you've set. Or if you know that you're doing effectively 5,000 rows, say, every day, you might, for example, at the end of a day, do a manual gathering of stats outside the normal stats window because you know that ad hoc queries are about to come in. It might be, I do a manual gather at lunchtime and maybe a manual gather at 8 in the morning, such that I know the stats are freshly up to date for the ad hoc queries. You can adjust the stats gathering process to the business processes that best align for the performance needs. The other option you can do is, if you have a set of plans that you're very happy with, we need to get out of that mindset of, because the plans are good, I won't touch the stats, and therefore everything will stay locked down. We've just seen that that's not the case. It's important that the only really way to say, here's a plan that I like, the best way to do it is with SQL Plan Management. That way you'll always get a consistent plan. Now, I stress, consistent plans does not necessarily mean consistent performance. But what you are doing is you're choosing a trade-off here. You're saying, I'm going to compromise performance potentially by making sure I don't get any performance nightmares, some sudden spikes. I'm looking at choosing to lock my plans down such that performance may degrade slowly over time, but it's going to stay consistent. An example of that would be this high boundary. Let's say I've used SPM to say I'm always going to use an index because I'm always getting just the last day's worth of data. Well, as we add more and more data in there, querying from a particular point in time, at some point that should flip over to table access full because you're scanning more and more data. But if you've used SPM, then you're always going to be using that index read, but it will slowly degrade in performance until such point you can actually decide, yep, okay, it's time to change the way I'm doing my plan, as opposed to one day at random, it goes from index to full scan and you weren't expecting it. So SPM is all about controlling evolution of performance, and therefore you might actually sacrifice the perfect performance, but you're getting consistency. As a fallback, if you really get stuck, what you can do is you can use set table stats, for example, to adjust those high values. If you don't have real-time stats, obviously setting table stats can be risky because you have to make sure everything aligns in terms of the index stat, the column level stats, the table stats, etc. But generally, it's not too high risk just to tweak, for example, the high value. If you have a table with has dates in it, or you have things like sequence numbers in it, sometimes just tweaking that high value using set table stats or set column stats is enough to keep those plans under control and under management. Okay. No questions. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the chat line. Stacks of questions. Okay, let's have a look. Where are real-time statistics kept? They are saved somehow. Yes. It's not like they're real-time and sitting in memory. They're actually kept. I do have a video floating around somewhere. Which, it's on my YouTube channel. If you go to my YouTube channel and search for Optimizer, you get a fair few videos, but one of them shows an example of conventional DML, and you get this interesting thing where normally if you do select, the number of rows for a particular table from user tables, you'll see, user tab statistics, you see one row, num rows equals 1,000. Under 19 real-time stats, you'll see a thing that says num rows 1,000 and real-time stats 1,100. So there's actually two rows, one which is the last time you gathered stats and one which is the real-time stats, because it's the pairing of them that actually gives you the complete picture. Because real-time stats is only capturing what it can capture based on the DML you do. You insert 10 rows, you delete 5. The net change is 5 rows. It doesn't say, let's redo all the histograms, let's redo all the, sort of the various bits and pieces that normal stats do. It's just what it can glean from normal DML to actually work out what's going on. Okay. Bernard, how would you deal with stats on tables which are more used like temporary tables, meaning intermediate search results, etc.? Stats would almost always be wrong because recalculated during the night. Good point. Dealing with stats on temporary tables is always a challenge. One of the things that has come in, which I think is it 12? Might be 12 or 18, is one of the nice things that helps to some degree is temporary tables can now have individual stats per session. One of the killers with temporary tables or global temporary tables was you would set stats in one session and they would be used for every other session, but of course they use their own global temporary table. So now you can have session level stats for global temporary tables. If you have permanent tables that you're using in a temporary fashion, generally the only way of getting around that is to insert yourself in the process somewhere. So for example, you populate the temporary table and then you do a quick gather stats at the end of that to make sure that the stats are going to be correct. Sometimes it's really just letting the database know how many rows are in there. So you could do that with a quick set table stats, or leave the stats blank and have a dynamic sampling hint in your ongoing queries. And that's a nice, easy way of simply saying, look, I'm not going to have time to gather stats, do a dynamic sample, therefore pick up the stats you'll need to then use this for the rest of the queries. Does that make sense, hopefully? Okay. Do you have any examples to show the plan change using AWR info? Not on me, but generally in an AWR report, when you go to SQL by elapsed time, SQL by buffer gets, all those different SQL by sections, with each expensive SQL, it'll also have a plan hash value, and click on that. And I'm not sure if it goes in the AWR report. You might have to just go look in $$ SQL plan statistics or DBA hist SQL plan stats. But generally, for each line inside a SQL statement that has a problem, you'll have a plan hash value as well. So the same SQL statement might appear multiple times if all the plans are bad, but if one SQL statement is running well and then it has a bad plan, you'll only ever see the bad plan hash value in your AWR report, because if the good plan was running fine and it's not expensive, then it simply won't be caught as a bad SQL. But there's always the plan hash value, which lets you directly straight to the plan which is of concern. And Dimitri says, how do I save the real-time stats during a switch over to standby? Flush it before the operation, the same before shutdown. Good question. I have a bad feeling that DBMS stats flush, what's the call? Flush database monitoring info or flush monitoring info? Bear with me. I'm just doing a describe on DBMS stats in the window that you can't see. What's it called? There's only 37,000 routines in here. One moment. It is. He scrolls back. Oh my God, there's a lot of stuff in here. Gather. Yeah, DBMS stats flush database monitoring info. Having said all that, I have a funny feeling it, in the first version of 19C, does not flush the real-time stats out. They are flushed out, I think, every 15 minutes by default, might be every 5 minutes. But I don't think that call actually flushes them out. I'll need to check again because I think that raised alarm bells when it first came out. People said, how do we flush them? And that routine may have been altered to actually do it, but I'll have to confirm that. But if a normal shutdown should flush them, but if you have to just immediately switch over, hopefully flush database monitoring info will flush them out. But if not, I'll check with Nigel and see what options there are available. Let me make a quick note in my notepad file here to check with Nigel, and I'll do a blog post on it. I know this is burning into our office hours time. Sorry. There we go. How are we going for time? Really badly. Oh dear. We're only going to get 3 done this session. This is a disaster. Oh well. SQL tuning best practice. Here's the question that came in. I'm a DBA, and the developers throw all sorts of complicated SQLs my way to tune them. There's so much information about tuning. Can you give me a simple process to follow? And before I go to my process, one thing I would encourage is a lot of shops still have this DBA developer separation. And often it's not just a cultural thing. Often it's DBAs sit in a different room, different office, different country, different continent, which I always find tragic. But nowadays with Zoom, Teams, Slack, etc., I would hope that the most successful project teams I've ever worked on, whether it's virtually or physically, DBAs and developers sit together. And that's one of the things that I find really problematic in the world of siloed technology skills nowadays. So I do think it's important that the closer the collaboration, the better. So environments where developers do write applications and throw them over the fence to DBAs are almost always going to be destined to fail. It's much better if DBAs, and I'm not talking about the sort of traditional DBA role, I'm talking about any person who has database specialist expertise. The closer you can sit them in with the developers, the more successful you're likely to be. Similarly, I worked at a place before I joined Oracle where literally the DBAs, including myself, and the developers, and even the testers sat literally in the same cubicle blocks. And that way, when the developers had some code run, they'd run their unit tests. For system tests, they'd literally lean over and speak to the tester. Or if the system test didn't work, the tester would simply lean back and say, hey, Bob, your code's junk. And that kind of close collaboration made for a very successful application. That project I left in 2014. It went live in 2010, and I know for a fact that it's still running pretty much unchanged today, 12 years later. Faither says, yes, vampires versus werewolves. Yes, that's what we're trying to avoid. Anyway, this is Connor's 3-step guide. The 3-step guide to tuning SQL. All you need is 3 steps. Step 1, forget about the SQL. And don't knock over your microphone. Step 1 is forget about the SQL. We're so focused often on the tech and the SQL sometimes that we forget stepping back and saying SQL is designed to achieve a business process. And often a lot of SQL tuning is simply asking what question is trying to be achieved, because sometimes it's not a case of tuning the SQL, it's a case of either throwing away the SQL altogether because you can get that data from perhaps a different source, e.g. a materialized view, or maybe even a different database, like a data warehouse instead of the live system. Or sometimes it's just explaining to the person that requested the SQL, not necessarily the developer, maybe the business person behind it, what the implications are. I've had a number of times where a requirement will come in saying, yep, we need to see total budget forecasts for the last decade, and we need it sub-second. And it's only when you go explain to that business person that, 10 years worth of data is 500 billion rows. If we want to achieve that sub-second, we're going to have to do some significant architectural and design changes. And often it's not a question of the business person going, let's do that. It's like, I never thought we'd have to scan 500 billion rows. We'll come up with some other, we don't need that requirement that desperately. So step 1 is always step back from the SQL, focus on the business function, and then tackle that first. Sometimes it means not running the SQL. Sometimes it means a different SQL. Sometimes it means, yes, we actually have to go ahead and take this existing SQL with the existing data structures and see why it's running slowly. But at least we've now got a point in the sand where we know we actually have to tackle the SQL in its entirety. Rule number 2 for me is all that matters is cardinality. And for the database optimizer, cardinality is everything. Now, this might sound like some sort of profound technological statement, but it's not. It's the same with any kind of process optimization, even humans. If you go to the shop, or if I go to the shop, I grab a basket when I walk in. In fact, nowadays I grab a basket, then I'll scan the barcode with my COVID app, and then I'll put my mask on, and I'll go through all that rigmarole. But ultimately, I grab a basket, grab a few things. When I'm ready to leave, do I just walk to any old checkout line? Of course not. I optimize. I look along the line and I say, okay, what's the best line? And I might say, bang, down there at lane 5. Lane 5, there's just one person there. I can't see their trolley, but they look like they're almost done. I sprint down to there, and what happens when I get there? The guy in front of me or the woman in front of me, it doesn't matter. They've got the trolley from hell. This is an optimization fail. My optimizer estimate was lane 5's the best. The reality was this nightmare scenario where it obviously wasn't the best. So let's talk about that with some real data. Many moons ago, I worked at the Western Australian Police Force, and therefore we dealt with all the vehicles in Western Australia. They're all registered through the police, etc. So here's a bit of realish data. And I say realish because it was at least over a decade ago. But this is roughly, I haven't grabbed exact numbers because that would be a breach of confidence. But effectively, I've got some rough numbers which represent Western Australian drivers. We've got about 4.7 million registered vehicles in Western Australia. Makes sense, there's about 2.5 million people in WA. I'm doing all the good things. I'm gathering all the stats we need. I'm putting full histograms on all the columns, etc. If I go ask the optimizer, how many vehicles out of the 4.7 million are Toyotas? There's about 600,000. In reality, there's 600,000 Toyotas in Western Australia. The optimizer thought there would be about 600,000, 590,000. As we saw in the earlier examples, optimizer estimate and reality, this is a good optimizer decision. It's probably correct that I should use the index range scan for this because my estimate of reality was pretty close to reality. It's the same with the shopping cart metaphor. If I found a good lane, I'd be happy I've optimized the process. What if I look at make and model? So now I'm looking now for Toyota Hiluxes. And it turns out that there are, out of the 600,000 Toyotas in Western Australia, nearly half of them are Toyota Hiluxes. Now, the database thought only 300 would be Hiluxes because there's lots of different Toyotas. There's Corollas and Hiluxes and Camrys and Pajeros might be Nissan, not sure, but lots of different Toyotas around the world. It turns out that in Western Australia, people love their Hiluxes. I have no idea why, because a Hilux, if you don't know, is a commercial vehicle. It's like a utility. It's like it's got a cab at the back. I did some research on this, and it turns out that the reason this happens, this is a little sidebar here, is if we look, Hilux is the number one selling car. After that, in Australia, Ford Ranger, also a commercial vehicle. RAV4, sort of a SUV, but also a similar kind of hatchback vehicle. Land Cruiser, once again, four-wheel drive kind of vehicle. Australians love all these commercial vehicles because you get tax breaks when you buy a commercial vehicle because the theory is you're using them for business. So half my friends have Toyota Hiluxes, even though they're not tradesmen, they don't go work on building sites, but they buy them because they get tax breaks, therefore they're cheaper, and they're obviously a very popular car with lots of space. Returning to the demo, the key thing here is, as just like the shopping center, it's the actual situation versus your estimate. I estimated there would be 300 Hiluxes. There was actually 280,000 of them. That differential is a problem because when the optimizer gets the estimate wrong, therefore the cardinality is wrong, that's when you have plans that go terribly wrong. And there's one fantastic hint that reveals all this information to you. And this is my part 2 of tuning SQL. If I can, I run the SQL. It's a problematic SQL with the gather plan statistics hint. You run the query. It says, here's your actuals, 257,000 queries, cars were actually Toyota Hiluxes. And then I run display cursor Oops, that's an incorrect bracket there. Display cursor with all stats last. Show me the optimizer statistics from the last execution of that query. And rather than seeing the normal execution plan, we get these two special columns. E rows, the estimated rows, and A rows, the actual rows. This is gold when it comes to performance tuning, because all you need to look at is where are the discrepancies. If those two numbers align roughly, like same order of magnitude, there's a very good chance the optimizer got the numbers right, which means there's a very good chance the optimizer got the plan correct. If the numbers are way out, in this case, we can see we thought there'd be 300 Toyota Hiluxes. There was actually 257,000 of them. We can draw questions. Maybe this index was not a good option to use because this estimate versus actuals was so far out. So this is my step 2. Once you've identified any cardinality issues, it really helps then focusing on the next step. Now, rule 3 is where you're going to hate me. Rule 3 is you then work from there, because the reality is it's the cardinality estimates that drive what you do next. For example, why were my cardinality estimates wrong? Maybe the stats were wrong. Maybe the stats were old, so maybe I need to regather stats. We saw that the stats were fine. I gathered stats after populating the table. But maybe I'm missing some histograms. Maybe the histograms would actually solve that issue. In this case, we had histograms on there, so it's not that. Maybe we needed extended stats. This would have fixed this particular problem. There was a correlation between the make, Toyota, and the model, the Hilux. There's not an even distribution of models amongst the make. We needed to have the correlation between those two columns to actually get better statistics. Extended stats would have fixed this issue. It could just be poor SQL. It doesn't matter if I've got good stats on the make and the model if someone's doing a query where the upper of the model or the lower of the make or substring of the model contains something. We might then need to do different kind of stats on the column expressions. But the key thing is we saw where the cardinalities went wrong, and then we start working from that with the SQL query to decide what's our plan of attack. And don't forget, some queries are impossible to optimize. If you've got a query with 37 predicates and each one has different expressions and some have a case statement around them, etc., there is no set of statistics available ever that will give the optimizer enough information to come up with a perfect plan. It's going to make all sorts of assumptions and guesses. So if it's impossible to optimize based on pre-calculated stats, we have rule 3 alternate version. One of the things I love doing is if you have a query that's really hard to tune, crank up the dynamic sampling to 11. Crank it way, way up, which simply tells the database, look, go ahead and run this query and do all sorts of scans on the candidate tables inside here to come up with real data that matches all those incredible list of complicated predicates you've supplied, including the joins, etc. So effectively, you're running your query almost slightly once to come up with the real data. How many rows will match this complicated set of predicates? Because of that, because I now have real stats on how this query rows will return, I'll generally come up with a really good plan, or the best possible plan that the optimizer is going to be capable of doing. Now that I've spent that time, spent that effort using dynamic sampling, that's going to cost you in terms of resource, but I've very good possibility of getting a great plan out of it. Use SPM, lock that plan in, and the job is done. You've paid that price once with a huge dynamic sampling, but now you've got the good plan. Use SPM, and that plan is going to hold on for at least until the next major change of database data to your database system. Be aware, as I said, there's a term we use in Australia called if you put lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig. All these things generally are bound to good database design principles. If you've got one of those systems where the most important piece of data is in characters 3, 7, and 13 tucked away in some column, and that column is stored in a JSON structure, and that JSON structure is stored in a binary Java serialized object, and you've stuck that into a blob, well, good luck. If you've got a bad database design, then you're always going to be up against it. So be aware that the optimizer can only work with what it's presented. So it does its best. I'm always amazed at how good the optimizer does, but the reality is a catastrophic database design is going to have you up against it all the time. And at some point in time, you might have to actually augment, adjust, change the design just to give the optimizer an even chance at coming up with good optimizer plans, because there are some SQLs that just are never going to run well because they're being hamstrung by a terrible database design. Let's wrap it up. The fewer questions I put on the schedule, the less I get done. Maybe the trick for me is to put like 20 questions on the schedule, and maybe I'll get through 10. Who knows? Now, I do have some Q&A. That's the end of the content, but I do have some Q&A, so I'll tackle that. But if you need to go, totally understand. I won't be upset when I see the numbers dropping off, but I'll tackle these 4 Q&As as well, and then we'll call it quits. Okay. Estimated and actual rows, all stats last, is present on 12.2 onwards. I think gather plan stats goes all the way back to maybe even 11.2, maybe 11.204. But anyway, that's out of support. But certainly all supported versions of Oracle have gather plan stats, I'm pretty sure. This video presentation will be saved on which URL? Please share your video. Yes, Caesar. After this, probably by tomorrow when I finish editing it, or over the weekend, if you go to asktom.oracle.com/videos, in fact, just go to asktom.oracle.com. At the top, there'll be a thing called videos. All the office hours sessions are recorded and published through that link. So just go to the videos tab and you'll see it there in the next few days. Bernard said, would dynamic statistics help for SQL statements and pure SQL blocks? Parsing it only once and the plan is locked in. Yes. I won't answer that here. I'm sorry to fob you off, but I will say Nigel and I spoke about this at length on our podcast about the balance between dynamic sampling, which is done for a parse, and for statements which are then reused. For example, in PL SQL, but even if they're not, if the same statement comes to the database with the dynamic sampling hint, it's only parsed once, so the dynamic sampling is only done once. Nigel came up with some interesting options as to how to overcome that. You can inject certain comments in there or certain fake hints in there to ensure that it gets parsed every time. And we also talked about a potential future option of being able to actually instruct a SQL to be parsed every single time. So check it out on the podcast. We go through that in more depth. And Unith has said, what about the temptation of trying to optimize a very complex SQL by trying to use a full set of optimizer hints? I'm not against that. One of the things that if I'm triaging a problem, and often SQL tuning is like triage. It's like if I'm an emergency doctor, and a patient comes to me, the first thing we do is we try to stop the bleeding. We don't try to find a cure. We simply say, this patient's bleeding, stop the bleeding, stuff a bandage on there, apply pressure. That's what a full set of hints might be. I've got a problem SQL, just throw in these hints to make it run well. I'll worry about the root cause later. So that's what I call triage. Often, a full set of hints is just slam it in with triage, right? Then, now that I've stopped the bleeding, now I work toward a cure. I'm going to get rid of the infection, stitch that patient up, etc., to extend the metaphor. That might be, okay, what's missing? Do I need indexes? Are the stats out of date? Can I use SQL plan management? Do I need adaptive cursor sharing, etc., etc.? Do I need to adjust the SQL text itself? All those things take time. And sometimes you've got 3 managers behind you going, what the hell is going on? My system is running slowly. That's where emergency hints can be quite useful to triage the problem, to buy you some more time in order to then come up with a more permanent and more robust solution. So I hope that answers that question. I think we're done. I think I've answered all the Q&A. Thank you for the Q&A. I do like talking. I know it costs us in terms of the amount of content we need to cover, but I do like the interaction. Hopefully it keeps it interesting for you as well. Hopefully I don't talk too fast during the Q&A because I get excited when I see the questions. Once again, thank you for your time. I get paid to do this and I do it for free anyway because I love doing it, but I appreciate you giving up your time and hopefully we've learned some things yet again today. Apologies for the sweat fest as it always is. I'll try to get the air conditioner quieter. And my dog, fast asleep. Good to see. Hopefully he's better in the morning. Thank you for your time. Thank you always for your interaction and attendance. And I'll see you next month on Database Office Hours. Good night, everybody.